The next presenter is Dr. Daniel Andrews.
Thanks. Is there a folder on here?
I'm going to show you 5 minutes.
Okay. Good morning. The title of my presentation is Gamification for Servitization. I'm in the Aston Business School. My colleague Andy Schroeder gave quite a good overview of the Servitization Centre yesterday, which I'm part of. But what I'm going to talk to, he gave that talk yesterday, so I'm not going to cover that ground again. What I'm going to talk about is really my perspective on the project for which I'm a research fellow, which is Gamification for Servitization. As you'll see from my background, I don't really have a business education at all. I started off doing an art foundation year, which you have to do in the UK before you do art and design at university. But then I went on to do an academic degree in social, cultural and film studies, during which I got interested in filmmaking and games design. And then I did a master's in multimedia games engineering, for which I got a scholarship. And while I was doing that, I got interested in serious games and storytelling for games. So I then got in touch with the person who became my supervisor at the University of Birmingham, because he was looking at something very similar. And I got an EPSRC scholarship to do a PhD in interactive storytelling. So these are my two key publications. I finished my PhD last year and I've been at Aston less than a year, so compared to my colleagues who presented already, this looks a bit pitiful, but these are kind of, in the field of computer-human interaction, this is the key conference in that field, and I was able to get two publications in that. But you'll note that they're quite specifically on interactive stories, and I actually developed an interest during my PhD in comics as a method of presenting stories, as presenting interactive narratives specifically. I didn't phrase them as comics a lot of the time, because comics have a bit of perhaps a negative association with them, but in terms of the ways in which stories can be laid out and data can be visualized, that ended up being a key part of my thesis, and I ended up using comics as a method of evaluating interactive narratives, and got some quite interesting results. So one of the first things we did was to look at how people can co-author interactive stories as a way of exploring user experience of interactive narratives, and also co-design and co-authoring and co-creation. This was a device in which we placed a physical paper on top of a multi-touch interface, and actually got users to draw scenarios and interact with them at the same time. And what was interesting about this was that through this kind of co-creation process, the usability issues came out during this kind of agile development, as well as the prototypes being produced at the same time. We also looked at how people read interactive comics, and what was interesting about this is that as you can see in these two pages, there are actually quite subtle differences within the pages themselves. Through evaluations of this, we found that in versions of the comics which were just printed, people read aspects into them which weren't necessarily goal-oriented or goal-directed, whereas with very subtle interactions in an interactive story, people could focus on quite specific areas. And it got us considering, and it got me considering, that in fact this kind of persuasive design could be embedded in through quite simple interactions. And from the perspective of creating serious games or encouraging people to follow a certain sort of journey, you could probably embed this within prototypes for training purposes. So now I'm at Aston, I'm kind of bringing that experience with me to this gamification project. As Andy said yesterday, we've already got established collaboration with 100 plus SMEs. We also have larger industrial partners and partnerships. But in the future, we'd like to integrate games companies into this process. And what occurred to us was that we could actually probably accelerate the economic development of both sectors by getting these two different sectors to work together. So, for my studies in the PhD, where I was getting co-authoring and co-creation of interactive comics, it occurred to me that when these kind of roadmaps are created for journeys into servitization, this kind of co-authoring could also occur between games companies and manufacturing companies. So at the moment we've been doing studies where manufacturing companies are kind of creating stories and narratives about how they go into servitization, how they go from product-oriented mindset into a service-oriented mindset, and where they've gotten to at this stage in their journey, how the barriers they've faced up until this point, and also projecting what sorts of barriers could come next. And at the moment, it's a bit of a mess when they come up with these kind of roadmaps. I can't show you a picture of the actual roadmaps because it's confidential, but it kind of looks probably more complicated than this, with post-its, symbols all over the place to represent different actions and events. But during this process, what we're able to do is categorize and code where these different events are happening and what the sorts of issues are in a range of categories. So going back to this slide, what I envisage happening next, and we're going to be holding an event in May where we're inviting games companies to collaborate with these manufacturing firms, is that we'll have the games companies on one side, the manufacturing companies on the other side, actually gamifying these scenarios. Oops, sorry, I'm losing control of this. And we envisage this kind of thing happening, but this is just a hypothesis at this stage. Obviously, we could integrate performance measurement into these kind of paths, that the journeys that the manufacturing companies take, and we could attribute points to the different journeys, and different trophies or something like that could be attributed to the correct journeys they take, or the missteps that they've made or could make in the future. And what we'd like this to be able to do is both inform the development of games which train companies to servitize and persuade them to servitize, in the same way that we saw that interactive stories before can be used to persuade people to follow specific goals. But we also want to see how games companies can actually gamify this process itself. The outcome here is that there are points attributed to these different goals, but what are the mechanics that are going on within these steps on the journey? And that to me is particularly interesting, because I could try and design something, but what about professional games companies, and how would they interact with manufacturers in this process? And what we aim to do through this is to give both sectors a new opportunity. The manufacturers to servitize through gamification, and the games companies to provide this service to manufacturers. Okay, that's all. Thank you.